Ian. Welcome back to the course, Confronting Humanism in Modern Jewish Thought. We've had some absolutely fascinating discussions of the Jewish Enlightenment, as well as some of the early efforts to integrate humanism in Jewish thinking. And today we have a really special discussion of early efforts to integrate humanism in Zionist thought. And so our speaker today, and for the last 3 sessions, is Yossi Turner, who's Professor Emeritus of Jewish Thought at the Schechter Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, and visiting professor at UF Center for Jewish Studies. Professor Turner, take it away.
Okay, good morning, everybody. And I'll be a little bit honest. I have to express my feelings.
Hold on, let me.
Okay, so that was a bit of a startling sound. I'm glad to see some of you up on the screen here at home. I feel a bit lonely. We're in a gigantic room with only a few people in today, but that's fine. I mean, all learning, teaching, and is a dialogue, and we're going to go ahead. Okay, so what I would like to do in order to start, as was mentioned a moment ago, today we're actually going to talk about the meeting or confrontation, if you will, between, we'll call it Jewish particularity and universal humanism, modern humanism, and this week in Zionist thought. And we're going to actually be looking at 2 texts, one from Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, and the other by Asher Ginsburg, better known, at least to those who know about him, as Achat Ha'am, Asher Ginsburg's pen name, who was the founder of what's called cultural Zionism. And I'd like to begin just by touching again, there's no need to go back to everything that was said in the past couple of weeks concerning modern humanism and how the confrontation between Judaism and Jewish thought and modern humanism is formed. We won't go back to those details, but a little bit of recollection is important in order to see in what way early Zionist thinkers, the founders of Zionism, like Herzl and Achat Ha'am, in what way the meeting between Judaism and humanism in their thought is both similar to or perhaps different than those of, let's say, Mendelssohn and Kochmal, who we've already touched upon. So just a little bit of recollection, and then we'll continue right on to the texts that of interest to us from these 2 thinkers. So the first thing I'd like for everybody to recall is that last week we mentioned the turn to modern humanism in Western civilization in general. While there are many facets to this turn, perhaps the most pronounced and the overall category for the entire transition from what's considered the medieval world to the modern world involves a transition, as we mentioned last week, from a theocentric point of view to an anthropocentric point of view, meaning from a worldview in which God is in the center and human beings are perceived as having the role either to fulfill his commands or not fulfill his commands, as opposed to the situation in modernity coming from modern humanism, the anthropocentric view, which sees the human being at the center of the universe. And we saw last week with Kochmal a really important and interesting question on this difference. I didn't mention it, tie it in explicitly, but as we're saying it, why not do so now? what was one of Krochmal's big points is that somehow we have to square the idea that the human being and the human creates his own or her own history, and that the human spirit in this context is also, or you might call the Israelite or Jewish national spirit, is also involved in creating Judaism as a historical phenomenon. This is a part of the anthropocentric, humanistic, modern worldview. So Krochmal actually took up the question, how do we square these two things, the traditional idea of God as creator and sovereign, and the modern human, this one that emphasizes the centrality of the human being, and with respect to Judaism, who's controlling history, who's constructing history? Is it God or is it the human? So these questions came up because of the transition from theocentrism to anthropocentrism. And very quickly, we saw this contour, we'll say, of modern humanism in Moses Mendelssohn's writing because of the fact that, or through his belief in universal reason as the basis for civil society. This kind of thinking, of course, was already there in the Enlightenment circles. In pre-modern times, before Spinoza, nobody could have ever asked even such a question. There was no such idea of civil society. That's one of the outcomes of modern humanism. We saw in Krochmal the emphasis on the human, right? As I just mentioned, exhibited through his call for the inclusion of critical historical scholarship of ancient texts into traditional study of Torah. Meaning for Krochmal, we can learn the Torah that says God did this and God demanded this, but also apply our knowledge of how the human spirit is active in preparing these texts, and what and why its conception of God is so as to write the text or prepare the text in this way. It's a real synthesis between the theological and the anthropological. Okay, so now we're leaving all of that behind, and I'm just looking for a moment. I had my phone. I must have left my phone in the car, so there must be a clock here. I just want to keep time every so often. You'll let me know anyway. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so we're going to leave these things behind now, and we're going to go to Herzl and Achad Ha'am, or if you will, we're going to go now to the clash of Jewish particularity and universal modern humanism in the Zionist idea, thank you, as these two expressed it. So let me just say something very general about, even before we talk about Herzl and Achad Ha'am, why Zionism could only come about in a modern world with a humanist culture, right? And very generally, when you think about it, it's very obvious because, in essence, what is Zionism? And we're going to go into this in the text in a moment. But for Theodor Herzl, and this is important to remember, Theodor Herzl is a Austro-Hungarian Jew. He was born in Budapest, or actually Pest. When he was born, Buda and Pest weren't united yet. He was born, and he lived most of his life in Vienna. And he was also a reporter in Paris. But all in all, Theodor Herzl was a cosmopolitan Viennese, relatively, or maybe even highly assimilated, right, Jew, Austrian Jew. And for that reason, as we're going to see, his consideration of the problems facing the Jewish people, particularly anti-Semitism, and its solution, which he saw in the establishment of a Jewish state, was actually made possible because of the way in which humanism became the dominant culture of the educated and, we'll call them, cultured Austro-Hungarian subjects. I mean, Vienna and Austro-Hungary, I'm talking about the cities, not the province, not the outlying areas, were the most of what was called at that time cultured places in the world. I mean, the name Vienna, we don't even have to talk about it. Modern humanism was a big part of that, and we'll see how humanism expressed in European cosmopolitanism becomes a part of Herzl's plan. When we think about Herzl's Zionism, the first thing we can notice that's clearly humanist, let's say rather than theocentric, if you will, is that Herzl's idea is that the Jewish people take the initiative to return to probably the land of Israel. It could have been someplace else for Herzl, but probably to return to the land of Israel, and not in the way that Jews always thought. Not by God sending a Messiah, right? A supernatural redemption. Not by God sending a Messiah to redeem the Jews from their suffering and exile and return them to the land of Israel in the end of days. That's the traditional theocentric Jewish way of looking at it. But here the idea is that because of anti-Semitism, the Jews themselves will seize the initiative and create a new historical phenomenon, which is a Jewish state in the land of Israel. So if you compare those two ways of looking at the possible return to the land of Israel, you can see how the pre-modern view is it's not anti-humanist, but it's not particularly humanist, while Herzl's political Zionism is. And the same thing with Achad Ha'am, except that Achad Ha'am understood the problems facing Jewish existence and ultimately the solution and Zionism in a different way. Achad Ha'am was also a humanist, but not the kind of humanist that's already expecting universal human values, right? Going back to Mendelssohn, to be reflected in civil society or society as such, right? Which Herzl was very much interested in. In his book, Alte Neuland, he actually models his vision of the future land of Israel according to what virtually everybody in Europe who educated would think is Vienna's ideal, right? Meaning for Herzl, it's that I don't want to go, maybe later on, for Herzl, the problem of anti-Semitism is just a horrible thing in the period of modern humanism. And the solution, again, is civil, political, a state. For Achad Ha'am, the problem is cultural assimilation. But here too, modern humanism is a part of it. Because Achad Ha'am, very interesting, the biggest difference between Achad Ha'am and Herzl is that if Herzl was a Western, right, Central European, but that means Western cosmopolitan Jew, Achad Ha'am grew up in the very, very, very traditional surroundings of the Jewish Pale of settlement in the Russian Empire, which is mostly the Ukraine. You know, I remember when everybody thought that was Russia, right? But it was the Russian Pale of settlement was mostly the Ukraine. Achad Ha'am grew up in that area. He was a part of a very traditional religious Hasidic family and surroundings, but became an atheist and a secularist, and reinterpreted his own Judaism, what was previously his own orthodoxy, into a modern secular humanist and atheist mode. So he's very interested, as opposed to Herzl, this cosmopolitan European Jew. Achad Ha'am is a very, very traditional, ethnic-oriented, secular Jew. So you can see this humanism too. What's the big difference? There was no emancipation in Eastern Europe. Jews didn't come into day-to-day contact with a non-Jewish civil society. Where's the humanism? Where's the modernity here? Very clear. When Achad Ha'am thought about the problem of Jewish assimilation, he realized it's a product of modernity, right? That European culture is much stronger, much more attractive for the individual Jew than the pre-modern Jewish culture is. But Ahad Ha'am understood culture and cultural education like a modern humanist. It's not that God commanded Judaism. It's that it's a part of the historical personality of the Jewish people. And because in modern times, European culture became so powerful, Ahad Ha'am thought the Jewish people must take the initiative to reestablish a cultural center in the land of Israel that would maintain contact, constant contact with the Jewish communities around the world, and in that way balance out the forces of assimilation. But here too, we're talking about a humanist position in two ways. One is human initiative, not divine, just like with Herzl. Two, the understanding of culture, of what Judaism is, not as a religion, but as a national culture, goes hand in hand with modern humanism that very much affected Ahad Ha'am. I'm going to stop for a moment. Anybody here or at home, any questions or comments to this point? Because we're going to go to the text. Yes, hold on. Yeah. Okay.
Were they contemporaries?
Okay, that's the next point. Yes. The fact that they were more or less contemporaries, and I'll fill out the information on that now.
Can I change your mic real quick?
Sure.
I just want to flip it, the mic part up.
Is it not so clear? Okay, fine. So part of, especially the second text we're going to read, Ahad Ha'am's text, can be better understood by knowing that they're contemporaries. But since you asked, I'll just fill in the information now because it will be important. Ahad Ha'am was born, I don't remember the exact year, someplace between time, if I'm not mistaken, between 1855 and 1860 in the Russian Pale of Settlement. He wrote his first articles that he published in Jewish Enlightenment journals in Eastern Europe around 1889 and 1890. And his first essays, and he continued with this for a long time, were actually criticisms of the Lovers of Zion movement, of which he was one of the leaders, because he thought that the policies were being implemented wrongly. And we won't go into that. It has to do with his idea of cultural Zionism. But we won't go into that for a moment. But the fact that Ahad Ha'am was one of the leaders of from around 1886, one of the leaders of this Lovers of Zion movement in Russia, right, means that he was a Zionist 15 years before Herzl ever even thought about returning the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And he was a cultural Zionist. Ahad Ha'am was convinced that the land of Israel was too small to absorb the entire Jewish people. He thought concerning the problem of anti-Semitism, that if the entire Jewish people moves to the land of Israel, that the local Palestinian Arab population will become anti-Semitic the way that other countries become anti-Semitic when the whole population goes. And by the way, Herzl gives an explanation why that happened. Ahad Ha'am didn't. But in any event, Ahad Ha'am thought the solution to anti-Semitism is in America, and that the land of Israel isn't big enough and cannot be a solution, but the land of Israel can be a solution to assimilation in the face of modernity, right? So it's 15 years before Herzl. Herzl, as we know from his diaries, the problem was anti-Semitism. We'll see in his text that for Herzl, assimilation would have been fine had it not been for anti-Semitism. The only reason Herzl thought it was important to be a Jewish people was because the anti-Semites wouldn't let them assimilate and not be Jewish. So if they're going to be Jewish, then they have to set up their own state. Otherwise, they're going to suffer anti-Semitism. But this is 15 years after Ahad Ha'am. And now, after Herzl comes on this brilliant idea, and we won't go into it, but great stories, how it's not so simple. He saw the Dreyfus trial, in Paris. It seems to be more about electing what we call close to Nazi, people who had ideologies close to Nazi ideology as the mayor of Vienna. That seems to have affected Herzl even more. But the fact is that what Herzl got the idea and said it can't go on this way, and published it, and then 2 years later in 1897, set up a Congress, the first Zionist Congress. Ahad Ha'am has a problem. Like you asked me about them being contemporaries. Ahad Ha'am was brilliant. I actually much more identify with Ahad Ha'am than with Herzl, although I think Herzl was right on a lot of points as well. But the thing is that Ahad Ha'am, as brilliant as he might have been, he didn't know how to stage a production the way that Herzl did. And Herzl set up 2 years after he first had a thought about Zionism, this assimilated Jew, had this incredibly large and interesting and vital first Zionist Congress. And why did Herzl, by the way, know how to do that? Apparently because he was both a journalist and a playwright. He knew how to do things for effect, whereas Ahad Ha'am only knew how to write and explain, right? But here we have a situation that the first Zionist Congress is happening, and Ahad Ha'am is very jealous of Herzl. He's a newcomer. And look, and everybody's going to his Congress. I think even Ahad Ha'am himself went. And all of a sudden, he finds all of his students who have been standing in the same place for 15 years, because Ahad Ha'am didn't know how to do much more than write out the ideas, and now they're going to Herzl. And Ahad Ha'am, this explains part of the character. It's almost, you can sense a little bit of venom when Ahad Ha'am writes his article about the Congress. So that'll be the second text. But yes, so the fact that they were contemporaries is very important, because Zionism grew out of the debate, the Zionist movement between Ahad Ha'am and Herzl, and the Zionism ultimately was a synthesis of Herzl's political Zionism and Ahad Ha'am's cultural Zionism. And had they not been contemporaries that also found themselves in a changing world, both in Eastern and Central Europe, Zionism probably wouldn't have come about. Okay. So with that, I think we can now go to the Herzl text, right? And this is on page 128. And what I'd like you to notice about this first Herzl text that we're going to read is that before he has said anything about the Jewish problem, which was the word, it's weird because for the Jews, the Jewish problem meant anti-Semitism. For many non-Jews, the Jewish problem very often was understood anti-Semitically, meaning that the Jewish problem is the fact that there are too many Jews. But the Jewish problem is a term that talks about these things. Before Herzl starts talking about the Jewish problem, see what he says about technology. And I'm going to ask you, because I get tired of talking sometimes, how this ties in with the idea of modern humanism. So look what Herzl says here. Will be the beginning of the second paragraph, third line on the page, talking about machines. And also, we all have to take into account, which is probably, we're a little bit older than my students at the university, so for us it isn't too difficult to remember what it was like in the age of the earlier industrial revolution, a half a century at least or more before the digital revolution, because Herzl's talking in that context. So he says, in machines. And I always say, wow, and what's this have to do with the Jewish state? He starts off talking about machines. In machines, we possess slaves of enormous power, which have made their entry into the civilized world as deadly competitors for manual workers. Just as an aside, reading that sentence, I find this sentence impossible to read without giving up associations of trying to foresee what will Herzl's position be. So in this sentence, so we have machines, And they're competitors for manual workers. Does this sound like Herzl's going to start saying things positive about the machines, or does it sound like he's going to say something bad about the machines? Bad, and because? Right, right. Which is surprising. I think this just shows that Herzl is a fairly honest person with himself, because from what this sentence, when we go further, the next thing he's going to do is actually praise machines, even though I agree with Rick that, and you probably really got Herzl right, because in his later book on the vision of what will be in the land of Israel, Alta Neuland, Old New Land, one of the things that he's impressing there is the aspect of a society that would be filled with social justice. So the idea, so he is afraid of what machines are going to do to human beings. Nonetheless, as we're going, gets them fired, by the way. I will never in the supermarket go to an automatic cashier just for that reason. People need jobs. People need to work. And anyway, so, but here we're going to find that the main point is that Herzl is going to talk about, positively about machines. On the next page, he'll come back and tie it once again to the problem of human beings, not necessarily the worker who doesn't have a job anymore, but it's the same idea. Let's read. In machines, we possess slaves of an enormous power, which have made their entry into the civilized world as deadly competitors for manual workers. Admittedly, you also need workers to operate the machines. But for this purpose, we have more than enough people. Only those who are not familiar, what a jump, right? You have to ask yourself, what's he doing? Only those who are not familiar with the situation of Jews in the various regions of Eastern Europe would be so bold as to maintain that Jews are not suited to manual labor or are unwilling to perform it. And I, by choice, read this. I understand it. I imagine that you do as well. It seems to me that he's trying to put a few themes together without actually succeeding in explaining why they go together. Afterwards, we'll understand why they have to be together for Herzl, because these are the issues that he's dealing with. The problem of the Jews, right? The idea that Jews don't work is one of the expressions of anti-Semitism. Somehow it's connected with machines. We don't know how yet, right? But the way he brings them together here, to me, it seems like a non sequitur. It doesn't have to bother us. I cannot ignore. When I analyze text, I can't ignore a problem. Here, I think there's a problem. We continue. However, continues Herzl, I really do not want to use this paper to defend the Jews. That would be useless. I think this is the first sentence in which Herzl actually relates somehow to the agenda of this paper or book. This is taken from the Jewish State, meaning that even if you could understand what I was saying until now and why I bring these different themes together, right? So we know that Jews have a problem. We know there are others who don't like Jews. So he's just thinking the first thing is, yes, that has to do with the topic, but put it out of your heads. I'm not going to enter the argument whether Jews are inferior or evil or anything the anti-Semitic. I'm not here to defend the Jews. I'm here to solve the Jewish problem, right? It's not everybody else say, oh, you pick on me as a Jew. Jews aren't like that. Herzl has no interest in that, defending the Jews. People are going to think what they want. He would probably try to educate, but getting into an argument about this has no point for him. Reaching a solution does. So he continues. It is not enough to find the appropriate arguments to change intellect and attitudes. If your audience does not have the capacity to understand, you are a voice crying in the wilderness. And it's clear that he's already becoming concerned that he's going to talk about the idea of Zionism, political Zionism, establishing a state for the Jews, as a solution to anti-Semitism. but he thinks that the general thinking in the public is not such that we're able to grasp onto the idea, to understand it, or to think it's realistic, or whatever. If, however, your audience has a capacity for understanding, then the whole sermon is superfluous. And you already know what I'm going to teach you. I believe that, now he's getting to the point of this beginning. I believe that humanity progresses to ever higher levels of morality, even though I consider this progress to be desperately slow. So he believes in historical progress. That's another belief of modern humanism. He believes, and it's because of this progress, he's going to say now, that his idea of Zionism can become realized. How does he say that? We continue. If we had to wait until the man in the street learns the tolerance shown by Lessing when he wrote Nathan the Wise was a play written by the famous Enlightenment playwright Ephraim Gotthold Lessing, and he based it on his friend Moses Mendelssohn, who we talked about 2 weeks ago. And the idea was the play is that, look, Jews can be quality thinkers, and use Mendelssohn as the example. But he goes, you can't wait for that in order to be tolerant. And he says, if when we would be waiting a long, because then we would have to wait a long time, as would our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, the spirit of time assists us from another angle. And basically, what he's saying is, there are those of us who think that anything that's worthy or reasonable in history is a matter of evolution. And he's coming, and Herzl's coming along saying, no, we know enough technology and have enough knowledge to be able to make decisions and initiate without waiting until everybody becomes more ethical and more understanding of racism, anti-Semitism than they are now. So that's the, and he finishes this part where he's talking about progress. And again, you could see here that he's right there at the end of the 19th century in Central Europe, when the Industrial Revolution arrived in Central Europe much later than Western Europe. It wasn't until the second half of the 19th century that Central Europe starts becoming industrialized. And he's there and saying, and he's associating human progress with industrial and technological progress. And now he goes, and because of that, we can start talking about my idea of Zionism. So, you know, the trains now lead us safely into the mountains, which we used to fear on foot, right? There are things we can do now that we couldn't do in the past. And now he's getting one level deeper. He's going to talk about it from his own value orientation. What's the meaning of progress for him? In my opinion, electricity was not discovered so that a few snobs could light up their ostentatious rooms, but rather so that we could solve the great questions of humanity by its light. And let's skip to the, right? The issue of the Jews is one of these great questions of humanity. And I think that even more than Herzl's emphasis on technology and progress shows him to be a modern humanist. And by the way, virtually all Zionist thinkers, and I have to say in this day and age, except for a select few who for me are extremely problematic, and I'm talking about the present, right? But almost all Zionist thinkers, when they presented the problems of Jews or of the Jewish people or of Jewish existence, it was done as a human problem. Not we're Jews and we need help, but as Jews, we're human beings who deserve the respect and help of humanity just as any other does. And that's what Herzl's saying here when he's talking about electricity was created in order to help with the problems of humanity. And one of those problems is that of the Jews. There's a lot to be criticized here. Some of this, I think, is associative, but you could see his mindset, and that's what we're interested in. And this brings up to the next point in Herzl's, right? This is really just still the introduction to the Jewish state, right? So the next point now is, so he talked about progress, talked about technology, the connection between technology, progress, and humanism. Now he's going to get into the next point that needs to be brought up. The problem for him, the specific problem for him as a Jew, is anti-Semitism. So skip to the next paragraph, skip a paragraph where it says, I believe I understand anti-Semitism. Here, Herzl is putting a lot together. He develops everything he says in this paragraph. It takes a few, 3 or 4 pages later on. We'll read it and summarize it because Herzl's understanding of anti-Semitism is very important. It's really, there are certain things he's pretty shallow on, in my opinion. His understanding of modern anti-Semitism is very deep. He says, I believe I understand anti-Semitism, which is a highly complicated movement. I view this movement from the standpoint of a Jew, but without hatred or fear. You can see that he's being a Western intellectual here. He says, of course it touches me. But that, for a reasonable person, that's not the way to consider it. Let's consider it objectively. I view this movement, the anti-Semitic movement, from the standpoint of a Jew, that we said, without hatred or fear. I believe I can recognize those aspects of anti-Semitism which are a coarse joke. And here he seems to be relating to the fact that there are many anti-Semites, whether in Paris or in Vienna or wherever they are, who probably never really thought about their anti-Semitism, but inherited it, and has become a part of the folk culture to tell jokes about Jews. And then there are those for whom anti-Semitism doesn't go any beyond that. But then there are those for whom, or Herzl himself actually sees, sometimes anti-Semitism appears as a common jealousy. And that's something very important that we have to come back to. A common jealousy, inherited prejudice, religious intolerance. Now, these last couple of things are already appeared in medieval anti-Semitism, right? Which is a religious anti-Semitism, right? That the inherited prejudice, right? It's enough to say that the Jews killed Jesus, and there's an inherited prejudice. But then he also adds, it comes out of religious intolerance, right? This was all there in pre-modern anti-Semitism. But then he adds, but there are also is an anti-Semitism from those aspects born out of alleged self-defense. And it takes a question, what does that mean? Alleged self-defense. I consider the issues of the Jews neither in social nor religious terms. And here too, I have to tell you, is that to say that he doesn't see anti-Semitism in social terms, I think is just wrong. If anybody sees anti-Semitism in social terms, it's Herzl, and he apparently means he doesn't see the solution to anti-Semitism in social transformation. That's why he needs a state. I mean, we'll see in a moment how he does understand anti-Semitism, and you'll see why he couldn't possibly take it entirely out of the category of society. But he says rather it's not. He says it's not a social issue. It's not a national. It's not a religious issue. It was in the Middle Ages, but not in the modern period. But it's a national issue. And why a national issue? The reason it's a national anti-Semitism is a national issue for Herzl is because anti-Semites dislike Jews because they're Jews, because they're a part of the Jewish people, because their history is different, because their culture, because they're a different nation. So with all the terminology here, I don't think Herzl is saying much more than that. Why do I say, though, that it has to be, at least a problem, a social problem? Because what Herzl explains in the next couple of pages is the following. And I remember doing all this in order to understand Herzl's understanding of anti-Semitism and how a state is the solution and how it works, of course, into modern humanism. Herzl's understanding of modern anti-Semitism was the following. He just looks back. He doesn't have to look back very far because remember, modernity for the Jews began only at the, you might say, the end of the 18th century or the beginning or middle even of the 19th century. And so that's no more than 100 years before Herzl is writing. And as he looks back, he's saying, let's see what happened. Because what happened was, okay, the Jews were given emancipation. They took positions in the economy and in society. And for that reason, it can't be divorced from social issues. And not only that, it wasn't only the Jews who entered the mainstream of society during the 19th century in Europe. There were a lot of other groups too, not national groups, not ethnic groups or religious groups like the Jews, but social groups. Those who had been serfs up until the 17th and 18th centuries had to find their way into a new modern capitalistic civil national state. You know, this is beginning in the 19th century. And what Herzl does is notice this. The Jews who entered civil society in the 19th century brought with them all of the tools they learned in the Middle Ages that are also necessary to be successful in modern civil society. They brought with them a tradition of learning, education, whereas most of non-Jewish society in the Middle Ages was illiterate. Because Jews in the Middle Ages were not allowed to be laborers, they were not allowed to own land, they were not a part of the feudal system, Jews became money lenders and people who worked in commerce and traveled internationally for that reason. What does this mean? It means that once they reach the modern period, the Jews have all of the credentials, all of the tools as part of their own heritage to be bankers, which modern society really needed because modern society is a capitalist society. They could be teachers. They could be lawyers because they all had the kinds of education and tools from their traditional background. Now Herzl says, look at the non-Jews who were up until a generation ago were serfs and are now need to climb the social ladder. You find the situation. They had none of that training. As serfs, they were kept illiterate. There aren't those traditions of education. They don't have the experience of international commerce or even intercontinental commerce. They don't have the ability, let's say, to go to the university and learn these things because when they were kids, they weren't taught to read. Overall, Herzl paints this picture, says, now you want to understand the nature of modern anti-Semitism and want to understand why it is that modern anti-Semitism is so different than medieval anti-Semitism. Medieval anti-Semitism was actually presumed a separation between the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world, and the relation between the two was understood theologically. God took his favor away from the Jews because they sinned and gave it to Christianity, and that's why the Jews are in this status in Europe, and so on and so on. It was a religious anti-Semitism. Here, Herzl says it's totally different. We talked about jealousy and self-defense. He's talking about the perceived need on the part of those who now enter modern society and we're at the lower ends of society and want to climb and see that it's not happening. And they're the real Germans, they're the real Austrians, they're the real Bohemians, right? How is it that the Jews who are never part of the society are climbing the social ladder, right? And the result, of course, is that both above, right, the elites, there's a movement going on in Germany, the German-speaking countries mainly, to bring back the clergy, to bring back the nobility, right? Put the Jews back in their place. This is coming from the upper echelons, the descendants of the old nobility and the clergy. And from below, there's this tremendous jealousy of the people who are still poor, while the Jews are beginning to actually be successful in modern middle-class society. Herzl says that that is the explanation of modern anti-Semitism in contradistinction to medieval anti-Semitism. And then he adds one more thing, and we can see this now. Take a look at the last paragraph on page 129. He says, here's a great statement compared to Achad Ha'am. We have tried everywhere, in all honesty, to assimilate into the communities around us while preserving the faith of our fathers. Remember, the demands of emancipation were to do away with the traditional Jewish community and give the Jews equality on the condition that they become patriots and become loyal members of the state. And the Jews did that way beyond everybody else because they wanted to be a part of it. And Herzl's saying, and by the way, this is the beginning of Zionism, not only with Herzl, but in general, the disappointments of emancipation when it became known that the anti-Semitic streams that eventually led to Nazism and worse were already appearing toward the end of the 19th century very powerfully. And Zionism, in all different ways, is a response to the disappointment of emancipation. But finally, Herzl is saying that after seeing, Dreyfus, after seeing Karl Lueger, the anti-Semitic mayor, that the emperor, the Habsburgian emperor, he was elected 3 times, and the Habsburg emperor every time set aside the election results because he couldn't stand having a racist as the mayor of Vienna. And when he won for the 3rd time, that was it. It's here probably that Herzl became convinced that anti-Semitism is so embedded, not in medieval Europe as it was, but in modern Europe as a modern phenomenon, that he arrives at the conclusion on page 146, just 2 lines. So here's the plan. In its basic form, the whole plan is infinitely simple. It just has to be if it is going to be understood by everyone. We should be given sovereignty over a piece of Earth's surface sufficient for the legitimate needs of our people. We will look after everything else. And then the rest of the book is the vision and planning. How do we get the movement going and all of this? Okay, so any questions or comments on Herzl to this point? I think it's pretty clear. You can see how the Jewish particularity and needs coming from anti-Semitism work into his modern humanism and creates the idea of establishing a Jewish state.
All right, any questions online or in OCOMIC?
Okay, so we have a little bit of time left. And here, just take a look at that. We're going to do the text of Achad Ha'am. Remember the guy from Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement? Very, very, very traditional, in some ways conservative, secular atheist Jew in Eastern Europe, right? And let's see the differences now between Achad Ha'am and Herzl on all the matters we've been discussing. And here we're going to read from the bottom of 266 to a little bit after the middle of 267. And we're going to stop along the way because Achad Ha'am makes a lot of interesting points here. But here, Achad Ha'am's writing, I think, is much better than Herzl's writing. He's a writer. He's actually a literate. What's the word for somebody of? He's a person of letters, much more a person of letters than Herzl. Herzl, by the way, was a lousy playwright. Even there, he wasn't very good at writing. Here's Achad Ha'am. This is from an essay that he wrote shortly after the first Zionist Congress in 1897. So even though he's putting forth his own view, we know it's a response to Herzl's political Zionism. And here he says, last paragraph on 266, it is not only the Jews who have come out of the ghetto. Judaism has come out too. So there are the Jews who have come out of the ghetto in the modern period, but there's also Judaism that has come out of the ghetto in the modern period. And the question is, what would Achad Ha'am possibly be referring to when he says, indeed, the Jews came out of the ghetto, were released from the ghetto in the modern period. Any ideas what he's referring to? So he's referring to the fact, you say, of emancipation and the causes of modern anti-Semitism. Before the emancipation, the Jews lived in traditional autonomous Jewish communities, not a part of the surrounding society. Afterwards, those autonomous communities were taken apart, and now Jews, as individuals, are citizens of the surrounding society. Yeah, that's what Herzl sees. The individual Jews who have become a part of the surrounding society, and as a result of the jealousy and the dynamics formed after emancipation, they're now suffering from anti-Semitism. But when Achad Ha'am comes and says, but Judaism also came out of the ghetto following emancipation, what he means to talk about is that we're here to talk about the problem of Judaism and not the problem of Jews, meaning the problem of Jewish culture after Judaism left the ghetto, rather than the problem of anti-Semitism following the Jews having left the... And the reason he does this, by the way, is because at the first Congress, Herzl's partner, I forget his name at the moment, used the term problem of the Jews. It's much better in Hebrew, tsarat ha-Yehudim. A problem, it could be a problem, and it could also be a metaphysical, failure or whatever. It's like, in Jewish communities that had polygamy, in the Bible, Sarah is the other wife, the second wife. So it's more than just a problem. It's a deep, it's a real deep thorn in your side. And Herzl's partner, you may say, in the West, we talk about the Tsarat HaYehudim, the problems of the Jews. There are those in the East, meaning Achad Ha'am, that talk about Tsarat HaYahadut, the problem of Judaism in modernity rather than the problem of the Jews. And now he continues. So what's the problem of Judaism? For the Jews, the exodus from the ghetto is confined to certain countries and is due to toleration. True, Jews became part of the other societies depending on the situation in those societies. But Judaism has come out of the ghetto, or is coming out of its own accord, wherever it has come into contact with modern culture. Here, the problem is not civil, it's cultural. Judaism comes out of the ghetto, and all of a sudden it means that it's in competition with other cultures, maybe religions too, but it's in competition now. It never happened before that Judaism was in competition for Jews with another culture. Now, when the Jews come out of the ghetto and Judaism comes out of the ghetto, Judaism is in competition with modern European culture, German culture, French culture, and he continues. The contact with modern culture overturns the inner defense of Judaism so that it can no longer remain isolated and live apart. And here, of course, what Achad Ha'am is doing, he's explaining a phenomenon that he's against, but understands. Jews in the first, second, and third generation after Mendelssohn, and then following emancipation, did everything they can to be considered German, French, Austrian, Italian, whatever, because that was needed, right? Achad Ha'am says, yeah, but when you do that, Judaism as a national culture, of course, is going to lose out. And all you have to do here is think about how easy it was for people to talk about German culture as being the highest culture. Think about the Jew who was considered lowly because he was just emancipated as a Jew. He wants to think of all the tremendous amount of young Jews who not only went to law, but tried to become university professors until they weren't allowed because of anti-Semitism. Everybody wanted to be a part of European culture. I don't know if I can sufficiently impress upon you how much modern culture was associated particularly with German culture and the humanist cultures, French, British, modern British and stuff, and how much this was considered a change in the world, going back to the idea of progress, right? It's enough that a majority of Jews in Germany wanted to know how to become German first and Jews second, if you want to put it. That's the problem of assimilation when it comes down to it. Now he continues, but in order to deal and understand Jewish culture and deal with the problem of assimilation, once again, as a humanist, we're not going to talk about God. We'll talk about the spirit of the Jewish people, the national spirit, and how that is a part of the culture that we're worried about. So he says, the spirit of our people desires further development. And here Ahad Ha'am is saying tremendous things. I wish we could analyze every sentence. Basically, we're not going to, basically what is he saying? He says, it's not that I'm in favor of Jewish culture at the expense of world cultures. He says, no, all through the ages, Judaism, even if not all Jews, or not even most Jews, Judaism as a culture maintained a dialogue with other cultures. All you have to do is read in the Bible, and you can see the Assyrian and the Egyptian influence. You read the Talmud, and you can see a Roman and Persian influence. You see, read Rabbi Nachman Krochmal. You see Jewish and German influence, right? You say, the problem is, how can we maintain the dialogue and be open to the world cultures without losing our own culture? In the past, that wasn't a problem because we lived in the ghetto, and that served as a strainer, right? To only let certain things through and not the things that would defend us. And it would destroy Judaism as a culture. So that's the idea here. That's why for Ahad Ha'am, the Jews now need a return to the homeland. They need a place where Jews can become, where you can call, let's say, the majority population, so that there'll be at least one place in the world that the dominant culture, not that there won't be other cultures, but because of the majority population here, as opposed to other places, the dominant culture will be a Jewish or Hebrew culture. And that's where it says, and then if this really unique settlement that he wanted to establish in the land of Israel succeeds, then they're going to export. They're going to print books, carry on dialogues with the Jewish communities around the world. And that is the fundamental idea of Ahad Ha'am's cultural Zionism. In terms of the practicalities of Zionism, just go down now to the next paragraph and say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 lines down from the bottom, I believe. Second word of the first word on the line is for this purpose, right? Since the purpose of Zionism for Ahad Ha'am is to establish a cultural center that can aid the Jewish people in countering the threat of assimilation, he now says, but for this purpose, and here it's clear that he's arguing with Herzl, and he says, for this purpose, Judaism can, for the present, content itself with little. It does not need an independent state. It needs a homeland, but not an independent state. But only the creation of in its native land of conditions favorable for its development. And what are these conditions? A good-sized settlement of Jews working without hindrance in every branch of civilization, from agriculture and handicrafts to science and literature. This Jewish settlement, which will be a gradual growth, right, as opposed to Herzl's revolution, this will happen in an evolutionary form for Ahad Ha'am, will become in the course of time the center of the nation. It doesn't have to be a state, but it has to be culturally enriched enough that Jews outside around the world are going to want to maintain a dialogue with it. So in the course of time, it will become the center of the nation, wherein the nation's spirit will find pure expression and develop in all its aspects to the highest degree of perfection of which it is capable. And then from this center, the spirit of Judaism will radiate to the great circumference, to all the communities of the diaspora, to inspire them with new life and to preserve the overall unity of our people. When our national culture in Palestine has attained that level, we may be confident that we'll produce men in the land of Israel itself who will be able at a favorable moment to establish a state there, one which will be not merely a state of Jews, but really a Jewish state. And now this last sentence where Achad Ha'am says, and if we establish a cultural center now, then who knows how many years in the future we can even establish a state and it will be a Jewish state. It seems to run contrary to his thinking. Nowhere else does he mention in a positive way the idea of a Jewish state. And it seems that what's happening here is that Achad Ha'am was really only interested in the continuation of the Jewish people through Jewish culture. And for that reason, he was interested in the land of Israel becoming a cultural center. The last two sentences where he mentions the state, he seems to be equivocating because of his own students who began to follow Herzl. And even though they also did not see the state as the ultimate ideal, they didn't see it as a problem and saw the state as then Herzl's idea of the state as the context in which the cultural elite will develop and fulfill its mission, land of Israel, and so on and so forth. So it could be that Achad Ha'am didn't really take the idea of a state seriously, except for the fact that Herzl was really pushing that, and he had to say something about it. So he said, yeah, if you really want a state, so maybe in the future. The fundamental idea of all of this for Achad Ha'am is that what's important is for the Jewish people to live its own culture, have expertise in the text of its past. And if we come down to it, what's the difference of a Jew become a cultured European or a cultured Westerner or a cultured Jew? With which texts, with which literary sources is he or she cultured, right? So Achad Ha'am, that's what's important for him. And Achad Ha'am says, if we can have even an autonomous community, meaning even maybe without a police force and without an army, I mean, that would be the difference between an autonomous community and a state. It's enough that you can govern educational policy, that you can encourage learning centers, right? You don't need all of the trappings of a state for Achad Ha'am. And therefore, it seems to be that he was saying, yes, and if we succeed in that, then it won't bother me if we have a state, because then I'll know it's a Jewish state. Again, I think that he had no real interest in a state. It didn't speak to him. I think also, again, it would be hard for Achad Ha'am to even think in terms of a state, because he was, once again, in the Pale of Settlement, right? That was a part of the Russian Empire. There were no independent states in the Russian Empire. The land of Israel was a part of the Ottoman Empire, right? So it was like there was no reason for Achad Ha'am to think in terms of a state. Herzl, who was living in Europe and saw all social and economic matters mediated through the structures of state, couldn't think outside of a state. And once again, also, the difference between them is that Herzl, as an assimilated Jew, couldn't escape his being Jewish because of anti-Semitism. And that's the problem that interested him. And he thought about the Jewish people, because he realized that Jewish people were going to, so we have to be a people that force it upon us, right? And that's, you can see clearly, statehood, political Zionism, assimilated cosmopolitan, as opposed to a Jewish culturalist who barely knows or is familiar with the state structure of a society, part of, right, these big empires. And they were thrown together eventually in the same movement, because practically speaking, from the outside, their ideas are very close. They want to return the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And the movement took upon itself both the statist and the cultural goals. Coming back to the bottom line here, neither Achad Ha'am would not have been Achad Ha'am and could not have established cultural Zionism had he not been familiar with the German term Bildung, education and culture in a modern humanist sense. That's how we understood the cultural challenge as a modern humanist, particularly Jew. Herzl could not have founded political Zionism had he not been so impressed by what the advancement of technology gives to human beings in their needs for dealing with fundamental problems, in this case, like anti-Semitism and the need to establish a new state, society or a new state as a solution to anti-Semitism. And that's Herzl and Ahad Ha'am on Jewish particularity and modern humanism. Questions, comments?
Thank you so much. We got
Question. How do you think they would view the state of Israel now?
Good, okay. It's a bad year to ask that question.
I know. That's why I'm asking it.
So I don't think that either Herzl or Ahad Ha'am would be very happy this year, although they both probably, at least last year, probably could have found things to be happy about. Ahad Ha'am, I had this debate, by the way, with colleagues who are out and out diasporists, who think that Zionism is terrible, and I won't even go into that. But what my part of the debate is Ahad Ha'am. I have a friend who has this very strong diasporist position visiting me in Jerusalem, and we're visiting another friend. The friend's little kids come in and just I forget what it was, just saying something about something, and use this term that almost nobody outside of Israel would know unless they're a Talmudic scholar or unless they really know the Bible well. But in Hebrew have become nomenclature, have become terms. And they have right? And I said to my diasporous friends, so now you understand the value of Zionism? Your kids can't talk like that. You see the texts, right? There's a limit to it. Most of Israeli society has not developed its interest in the Jewish sources of the past, and only a significant but not a large section of secular Jewish society in Israel has an interest in developing Jewish or Hebrew culture. By the way, I think that's growing now. I think there are those in Israel who realize that they need more than to just be against the government's proposals of legislation. So I think Ahad Ha'am would value the fact that Zionism actually created in Israel, or recreated or reconstructed, a historical collective Jewish subject. I think this year it might be falling apart. I hope not. I'm optimistic, but that's what I said last year. Herzl would have liked the idea that a state was created that actually can protect Jews. He probably would have been torn apart that the state couldn't have been created before the Holocaust, and it took another 3 years after the Holocaust was over, because those were the processes he saw, the beginning of those processes. He saw them, and the state couldn't help. But I'm sure he would be happy that Jews who need what do they call it, a place to be secure, would have Israel to go today. Herzl could not be happy with what's going on in Israel today because he was such a humanist, and he wouldn't understand how it's even possible to think about emphasizing the particularist aspects of the judicial system without emphasizing the universal humanist values of justice. To even consider one without the other would have been unheard of for him.
I have another question about Ahad
Ha'am, yes.
Ha'am and his ideas about the culture of Judaism.
Right.
Where did the ideas of culture come from, and how does that relate to scientific study of sociology, anthropology, and how does that reflect also the political environment at that time of imperialism and colonialism?
Okay. I'll start with the last question. You might have to remind me of the preceding. Concerning imperialism and colonialism, as far as Ahad Ha'am was a humanist, I don't see where he criticized or was aware the problems of imperialism or colonialism. I think, like most humanists in his day, it was just a fact. The way we accept that the world organization is a matter of states, now with global economic relations. So I go, most of us don't think about it, whether it's good or bad. It's the fact of civilization. I think that's the way Ahad Ha'am saw colonialism and imperialism. And I see it because I see that he uses terms, naively, not critically, not thinking about them. So that was the last question. Concerning, and I'll go back to the previous, right? Remind me?
The genesis of culture.
Right. So here's something really very interesting. Basically, it came from Ahad Ha'am reading German literature and German Enlightenment literature, Mendelssohn as well. And I think, like I said before, this idea of Bildung, the idea that the individual's identity is connected with the identity of, let's say, a family, a community, and an ethnic group, which was, if you read Goethe, you read Herder, in German, there's a lot of thought going on in Central European philosophy concerning the human spirit and how it works and the relationship between the individual, community, ethnic group. And the thing is that once you learn these things, and then you go back and take a look at the Bible and the Talmud, you see, they're not talking about principles in the Bible and Talmud, but in terms of the culture that exists there, it's a heritage that's handed down from family to family. And then you have figures who in the Bible were maybe messengers of God, and for Ahad Ha'am were just wise people who attained that status because they're wise people and led the people because they had knowledge and understanding of that spirit, the national spirit that runs through the individual and all of that. So I think it's between it's learning German literature and philosophy, and then trying it out on the Bible and classical sources. And then the last thing, now considering science, when Ahad Ha'am started writing, sociology was not a big science yet, certainly not like 20th century sociology, but there was already Marx, and I forget at the moment the name of the really famous social Darwinist in Eastern Europe that Ahad Ha'am quotes a lot. He's very much on what was then the leading scientific views, maybe views today that would be discounted. His logic, Ahad Ha'am's logic follows through whether or not you agree with the source that he's renting on. But just an example, one of the things that Ahad Ha'am maintained, when he asked the question, by the way, Ahad Ha'am saw himself as a student of Krochmal, and he copies whole sentences from Krochmal into his text. So one of the things that he learned from Krochmal is to ask the question, why is it that all of the peoples of the ancient period that appear in the Bible and surrounded the Israelites, why are they no longer around and Jews and Jewish culture are? And the answer that he learned from Rabbi Nachman Krochmal was because that when it came time for destruction and exile, in the biblical period, thank God the Jewish people had prophets rather than Talmudic scholars. Prophets have vision. They express the national spirit through a hope and expectation of what's going to happen in the future. And when times changed and the Jews were able to use that minimal spiritual communion in order to reestablish their homeland, or however we want to call it, they didn't go back to First Temple Judaism. They interpreted and built a new level. And after the Second Temple destruction, the Talmudic scholars already developed the idea of the Messianic age in the future, and then going into exile. It was atonement for sins. Again, Ahad Ha'am is an atheist. He doesn't care about the religious justifications. What he does care about is now that there are Talmudic wise people who are actually giving a basis for Jewish cultural continuity through the exile up until the modern period. Now he's coming along, and he quotes, I forget his name again, this Darwinian, this social Darwinian, and Marx he doesn't actually quote, and in order to form around him, based on these understandings, a new elite, a new intellectual elite after the prophets and the Talmudic president. So we need Jewish wise people today to deal with the challenges of assimilation. Otherwise, we're not going to last. He thinks, and this goes back to Krochmal, that even though he's a secularist, Krochmal was not a secularist, the idea of God as creator of the universe, he thinks left something in the Jewish historical spirit that always makes Jews in times of crisis look beyond into the dark. If your God is not the power of the wind or even the idea of beauty, but rather the creator of the universe, it's like you have something in your mind that makes you always go beyond the present situation. He thinks that, so again, he's combining science with his own Jewish interpretations of the past.
Well, thank you so much, Professor
you.
Turner.
Thank you. I
I
hope you
look
enjoyed
forward
it.
to celebrating a happy Passover.
Yes. Oh, I forgot it was Passover this week. So if you don't mind, if you want to understand Achal Ha'am, Passover is the way to do it. I mean, like, what is the Passover Seder? It's, the last, anybody who's familiar with it, one of the last songs in the Seder, they're talking, is that the father buys a goat for two pennies or whatever, and then the stick hits the goat and the person burns the stick, and then finally God comes and does everybody in or whatever. The same, that's just a visual or a child's, almost a comic's way of expressing the idea that in every generation, the past is still present, and now they reinterpret it to have meaning in the futures. Every level eats up the previous level and then continues on to the next. That's Achad Ha'am's idea of Jewish culture, and I have no doubt about it. Among other things, he took it from the structure of the Passover Seder, which is actually the structure of what you might call midrashic thinking. The most traditional form of Torah learning all through the ages is learning the past. You almost play at it like, I'm just learning what was, nothing else. But as you're learning it, you're already translating it, interpreting it, and creating new things from it. So I think that's happy Passover, and that's the way it says it to say. What is the line there? In every generation, one must see himself as though he was saved, from the slavery in Egypt. And when they debate what that means, I think the most sensible thing is that if it wasn't for that exodus from slavery then, I wouldn't be a free person to develop my culture now.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
And we'll see you next week.
Yeah, next week we're on Zoom. I'm on Zoom too next week.
Our professor will be on Zoom, but we can all meet here or go online.
And if we get to that, I'm back for the last two sessions. Great. Terrific. Thank you very much.